Dit is Dinsdag die 19de Maart. Ons gaan aan met The Long Lost Grave. Kathy, her wet hair in total disorder after ripping off the rubber hood, stood shivering beside Rob, slowly sipping the coffee. "Quite a day," she stammered, shivering. "I thought this last dive would never end. My arms feel as if they are gone." He shook his numb arms and grinned. "And my body is still shaking with that hose. We will survive," she muttered. He grinned. "Good girl." "How did it go up there?" Rob asked as they watched Herbie and Jos loading the empty oxygen cylinders on the dinghy. "As you can see, not exactly exhausted, but we kept up with you." Herbie glanced at Kathy, despite a certain person's doubts. Suddenly, grinning very broadly, he added, "And guess what? I didn't become sick. Those pills are a miracle, huh, Jos?" But Jos mumbled some indistinct reply about ungodly methods interfering with natural seafaring phenomena. When the hearty laughter subsided, Herbie touched the mesh basket questionably. "What about this and the cannons?" "We make everything ashore and go through it at camp," Rob replied. "After a hot shower, of course." "I agree to that," Kathy said, still shivering. After diving for such a long period of time, not even the wetsuit could keep the body temperature up, and while the boat crew loaded the gear, Rob helped her out of her clinging wetsuit top. She turned her back to him as she dried herself. Donning her tracksuit, she climbed down the ladder to the waiting dinghy, followed by the other two. "You kids are crazy," Jos mused past his pipe. "That thing won't make it ashore." Rob chuckled. "We'll make it, Jos, and here is still place for you. Come along, we've got lots of space." "Perhaps in camp, but not on that dinghy," Jos shrugged. "But do not fret, son. I prefer staying aboard the Dutchman. I have my bed and food, so it's no problem. But you go ahead and go ashore. I will still be there tomorrow, or here tomorrow." "At 7 then? As you say, son." Jos watched the dinghy on its shore-bound journey. What some people won't do for money, he thought wryly, but then, if he was a young man, he would probably have done the same. But at his age, he was wary of too much money. There are too many greedy people around these days. With a sigh, he turned and crouched through the saloon door. Better to be prepared, he sadly thought as he fumbled under his bunk and brought out a double-barreled shotgun. Slowly he unwrapped the oily cloth. Despite its constant use at sea to shoot seals with, there were very little traces of rust on the well-cared-for gun, and Jos felt satisfied. Flexing it open, he checked the barrels and thumped 2 fresh AAA cartridges in the chambers and snapped it closed. Carefully, he rested it against the bulkhead within easy reach. Years had taught him that where money was on the cards, men became mad. He had a feeling about this gold. That damn albatross. Ashore, the tent camp with foamy beers and a running compressor, the three were rummaging through the day's findings. Refreshed after a warm shower, they carefully studied each item, trying to identify it. And although there were numerous interesting and exciting pieces, there was no sign of the gold yet. "Perhaps tomorrow," Herbie said hopefully as he fetched refills from the fridge. "It's a large area to search," Rob thought aloud. "It may take some time. We even may not find it." "Oh, now Rob, don't be such a pessimist. Of course we'll find it, and you will buy that farm of yours." Kathy spoke sharply. "It's there, we have the proof, and you have it. There is gold on the Liberty. At least there was when the captain wrote his memoirs, so all we have to do is search. Herbie wheeled around, one hand still in the fridge, staring at her in bewilderment. Something she had just said, but they did not notice the expression on his face. To search is fine, but our friends are not going to sit idly, you know. Maybe they will wait until after we have found the gold. He shook his head. No, they won't take that chance. Now, they know the gold is down there, but once we have removed it, we can easily put it in a safe place. No, Rob drank from his beer. They won't wait. Any time now. Herbie placed 3 ice-cold line lagers on the table between them. What? He asked slowly. If the gold is not on the wreck anymore. In the stunned silence that followed, they could just stare at him in amazement. At 6:30 the next morning, Rob knocked on Cathy's door. When there was no reaction, he knew that she had overslept. Walking around the rondavel once and still detecting no obvious signs of life, he continued knocking, this time far less gentle. When there was finally the sound of hastily moving feet, he was quite busy hammering the door down. The door opened and he stared. The rebellious hair that framed the flushed face proved his suspicions, and the t-shirt that she was wearing not nearly enough to cover everything sufficiently. Am I late? She asked sleepily, rubbing one eye with the back of her hand, and then she lifted her mouth for him to kiss. Ah, she smiled sleepily, that's much better. Now I'm awake. Girl, he growled, if you don't get out of here and dress, you might regret it for the rest of your life. Her eyes flew wide open. Oh! As if she suddenly realized that her virtue was in grave danger, she hastily made her way to the bedroom. You can make some coffee, she said as she closed the door. Rob groaned. He had seen a little more than what was necessary. I don't just stand there, she scolded seconds later, and he started. The coffee won't make itself, and I refuse to go diving without coffee first. Have you perhaps seen a ghost? And a teasing face peeped around the door. No, not a ghost, but a nymph, Rob muttered as he stomped to the kitchen, where he filled the coffee maker with water and coffee. The coffee maker had scarcely begun to splutter and cough when Cathy whirled into the kitchen wearing a tracksuit. Her hair, although brushed, still framed a face that bore traces of sleep. She came right up to him and flung her arms around his neck, pressing her head against his chest, and sighed with content. Rob closed his arms around her and hugged her to him. Oh, I can wake up like this every day of my whole life, she murmured dreamily. What? Being hammered awake? He joked as she glanced up with an innocent expression in her eyes. No, you silly man, being kissed like this. And to demonstrate, she pulled his face to hers and kissed him thoroughly on the mouth. The coffee was ready by the time they broke apart, breathless and laughing. Herbie found them 15 minutes later with large mugs of coffee and eating traditional homemade rusks. For a moment he stared at their faces, feeling exasperated. Then, remembering his lack of a decent breakfast, he pulled out a chair and demanded the same. It was almost an hour later when the grey rubber dinghy pushed its stubby bow into the long rectangular swells in the river mouth. Half a mile away, the Flying Dutchman rode the sea patiently on its heavy anchor, while a lazy wisp of smoke curled upward above the funny-looking chimney. Old Jos had just finished breakfast. I thought you said 7 o'clock, he commented dryly as the dinghy came alongside. Hi, Jos, Cathy called a friendly greeting and gestured helplessly. You know how these young men are nowadays. Can't get up in the mornings. Rob threw a diving booty at her, but she ducked with a giggle and the booty slapped into Jos's chest. He chuckled merrily. It looks like there is some disagreement about that. You bet there is, Rob said indignantly. It was a certain young lady who overslept shamefully. Just follow my eyes. Jos laughed, choked, coughed, and spat overboard. You kids, but well, whoever is the guilty one, the sleep seems to have done you good. He puffed on his pipe, a cloud of smoke around him. There is the coffee, kids. Oh, don't bother, Jos, Kathy continued. They have just emptied my month's supply of coffee. The two men in question denied the accusation vehemently, uttering groundless threats, highly amused. By the time you two decide to start working, I'll be back from the second dive, she remarked dryly. For a few seconds, Rob stared at her and then burst into a frantic scramble as he accepted the underlying challenge. In his haste to don the still wet wetsuit, he awkwardly danced on the wet deck with one foot only halfway through the rubber leg. He lost his footing and tumbled flat on his behind. Laughing and cheering wildly, the others watched his comical efforts, which he exaggerated much to their amusement. Breathless with laughter himself, he lastly donned his mask and flopped backwards into the water, where he convulsed into roaring laughter, pointing up at Kathy. During all the fun and humour of his acrobatics, she had never finished her own dressing, and now she stood aghast. You monster, she breathed as she finished quickly. You've tricked me. And on that cheerful note, the second day of earnest diving began. Rob and Kathy operating below, while Jos and Herbie were handling the surface side of the operation. All went well, and the prospects for the day were looking good. It was then that Jos saw the boat. The 45-foot cabin cruiser approached from the southwest at a speed of 18 knots. Its sleek white hull cut smoothly through the blue seas, its curved, sharp bow slicing the water and spilling neat white bow waves to the sides. And as the majestic cruiser bore gracefully down on the squat fishing boat, the September sun reflected the shining superstructure with its marvelous lines. 8 o'clock Tuesday morning. Ashley Gordon Forbes was standing on the open bridge. Dressed in white, he held a pair of powerful Zeiss binoculars in front of his eyes, pointing the large bluish lenses to the northeast. Next to him, also in white, stood Will Stein with the spiked wheel clasped in firm hands. His lively eyes were bright and alert. Even once in a while he shot a sideways glance at the slender Selina Nodia on his other side. Auburn hair streaming behind her, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, she faintly smiled as the wrecker cleaved the calm seas. His eyes involuntarily dropped down over her well-curved body, stopped at the well-filled shorts that she was wearing. He guiltily averted his gaze as he became aware of her watching him with a sly smile. Behind them, Klaus Weber and Dan Johnson were making small talk while impatiently glancing towards their destination every now and then. On the quarterdeck below and aft, the rest of the crew were idly preparing the diving gear while cheerfully chatting in the morning sun. Gordon Forbes frowned when he lowered the binoculars. "Look at that," he said, and handed the binoculars to Will. "Holy, that's no rubber dinghy. That's a damn large boat." Ashley nodded gravely. Something had seriously gone wrong. Instead of a tiny Mk2 rubber boat were a large fishing boat, which surely would upset their plans for this morning. And for the first time he began to wonder whether the takeover was going to be as easy as he had anticipated. Behind him, the others had fallen silent as the presence of significance of the fishing boat dawned on them. On this beautiful and bright sunny morning, the controls had been relayed to the open bridge, and Will heard the musical droning of the mercruiser as he slowly eased back the throttles. The wrecker rode her wake as the speed bled away until she lay a bare 25 meters from the fishing boat, her twin engines idling gently. They have divers down, Will said uneasily. High against the fishing boat's mast was a navy blue and white diver's flag, not at all so amateurish. They were expecting us. Hell, now what? Silence, Gordon Forbes held up a hand. He needed to think. He would have to change his strategy. On the whale deck above the small saloon, Jos sat cross-legged, smoking his pipe. Casually across his lap, but quite visible, rested the double-barrel shotgun with its twin muzzles pointing at the newcomers. Standing in the stern of the boat, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, was Herbie, suspiciously eyeing the wrecker and at the same time admiring it. He whipped up his hand, and in a blur of movement, the dagger flashed across the unsteady deck and pegged with a dull thud in the mast 20 feet away. Another thud, and the second dagger pegged next to the first. Then, apparently undaunted by their presence, he spat on the water before crossing the mast. Or to the mast. He repeated the feat faultlessly. Wolstein breathed out slowly. The morning was suddenly not so bright anymore. These men were no amateurs, as his eyes roamed over the squat fishing boat. He picked up all the telltale signs of well-organized group. The specialized diving gear, the diesel-powered pump with hoses in the water, the signal rope and the mesh basket into which De Boer was just emptying a bag. Far from 3 lobster drivers, like he had been told, and his heart sank. This wasn't going to be easy. The crew on board the wrecker watched the activities with uncertainty. There was no doubt about the undistinguished mistrust of the 2 men aboard the Flying Dutchman, nor of their deadly seriousness. They intended to use their weapons if needed to. Damn them to hell, Gordon Forbes muttered furiously through clenched teeth. His plans were sabotaged by a damned journalist. Is that the journalist? He asked, frustrated. No, Selina replied softly, staring at the lanky and muscled body which she had felt upon her not so long ago. That's the brother, Herbie. Robert must be down in the water with the Moor woman. Who is that old bastard? Jos Visage, a local fisherman, and he can be difficult, Klaus answered grimly, angered by the idea that Cathy was there with the enemy. Yes, the enemy, he thought viciously, and slowly a feeling of scorn, contempt and hatred began boiling up, starting deep in his soul and spreading outward through his body until his head ached and his eyes burned with fervent hate as he glowered at the Flying Dutchman. The presence of the squat old boat became synonymous with his failed efforts with both Cathy and the wreck. He realized that he wanted the gold more than anything else, even if it was only to avenge his own humiliation. He would not rest until the enemy was gone and the wrecker firmly in control. Next to him, Gordon Forbes noticed the intense hatred on his face and instantly recognized the value of this man in his future plans. He turned to Will. "Take us back," he ordered curtly. It was clear that their plans for the day had been foiled. There was no use in loitering around. Without another word, he wheeled and disappeared down the ladder into the lounge with Klaus and Dan Johnson on his heels. It was an unexpected setback, nothing more. They would be back soon. Pushing the throttles forward, Will spun the wheel to starboard as he felt the slight vibration as the propellers bit into the water. He was uneasy. Things were not going as planned, and he wasn't sure exactly why. Nor did he know what the next move will be. And as he gently increased the speed to 18 knots, he had an uneasy feeling about the large amount of arms and ammunition aboard. Selina was standing quietly and subdued beside him. She had undone most of her buttons, drinking in the sun on her braless bosom. She was thinking about Herbie. Will Stein blanched. This woman, one day. "They will be back," old Jos puffed his pipe thoughtfully, and worried expression on the wizened old face. "And next time they won't just leave like today. Perhaps we caught them off balance today, but these types don't give up easily, not when there is money on the table." Herbie nodded sullenly. He had to admit that they appeared to be formidable force. Not even Rob had expected such a large outfit. Why, the man must be a millionaire, he thought wistfully as he thought of the sleek and beautiful cabin cruiser. And maybe old Jos was right. They didn't look the type that would give up easily. He was greatly disturbed when he recognized Selina Naudé high up on the open bridge, then Gordon Forbes, and lastly the despicable Bailey on the quarterdeck. He had watched the rest of the crew, but they didn't seem familiar. So this, he thought, was what they were up against. A beautiful and well-equipped cabin cruiser, a formidable member of crew, and obviously unlimited financial resources. The equipment would undoubtedly be of the highest quality and the best available. On the quarterdeck, he could see the stacked diving gear and equipment, even a tough-looking anti-shark cage. But what was worrying him most was the fact that he didn't know what to expect next, and they undoubtedly would have many different contingency plans in place. Herbie grunted as he glanced around at their awkward outfit. No less efficient at present, but so damn vulnerable to no alternatives. If Gordon Forbes somehow succeeded in driving them off this spot, the treasure wreck would be lost to them. The bastards seemed to have both the means and manpower to do it. And support? It seemed most likely. Men with money always seemed to have all the support they might need. "We'll be ready for them," he snarled, but felt immensely helpless and without any ideas or answers. Rob detested firearms, and the idea of using guns for protection appalled him. But how else were they going to keep Gordon Forbes and company away? "We will somehow stop them, won't we, Jos?" Jos didn't reply. He was far more concerned than he would ever admit. Klaus Weber was aboard that boat, and there was absolutely no love lost between the two of them. He was a bully and a brute in the clothes and position of a respectable man, and that worried Jos even more. But he didn't speak his mind. Maybe his shotgun did the trick this morning, but would the gun-shy Rob allow him to use it? He shrugged as if to clear his confused mind. He was worried. for they won't be back. What then? That damned albatross, and a shiver ran down his spine. So far his premonition had been proven correct. That evening beside the campfire, Rob was unusually quiet. Staring into the flickering yellow flames, his mind was busy. He tried to imagine himself in Gordon Forbes's position, what he could have done in that situation. And the answer was clear. Drove them off, get control of the wreck. But the thought kept worrying him. Although Rob did not get closer to any answers, he realized that it was time to take a few precautions. He was still uncertain how. There was another disturbing issue. Herbie's remark the other night about the gold not being on the wreck. Was that at all possible? And if it was, then where could it be? Rob sat up until late that night, considering and contemplating. But when he finally went to bed, he was still as confused as before. However, one thing stood out clearly. Gordon Forbes and Company meant serious business, and they could not delay any longer. But what would they try to do next? They didn't have to wait long. Jos Visage glanced at his watch just as Herbie cranked up the 2-cylinder diesel for the second time that day. Not yet 8:30, and already they were busy with the second dive. This morning no one had overslept. The anxiety about the wrecker's appearance the previous day had ensured that. At 7 o'clock sharp, Rob and Kathy had faced the depths for the first time. It was a beautiful day, the best so far since the storm. The sea was calm with long occasional swells and wind still. The usual seabirds about, a few seagulls bobbing expectantly close by while the sun was blazing down on the blue seas, and the great number of gaily dressed tourists who could be seen crossing the suspension bridge ashore. It was as if everything, including the weather and the sea, were improving in friendly preparation at the onset of the September school holidays. But the two men aboard the Flying Dutchman hardly noticed these beautiful changes, for they were uneasily staring at the approaching cabin cruiser. Swearing under his breath, Jos reached through the open door for the shotgun and lifted it into view. With a feeling of foreboding, they watched the wrecker slowly surpassing the previous day's stop, steadily edging closer until they could see every line and feature on the grim faces of the crew. The wrecker approached the fishing boat slowly from the southeast, almost level to it with the coast. Will Stein judged the sea knowingly and skillfully kept the bow pointing at the squat old boat. 20 meters away, he eased a little to port, idling the wrecker perilously close past the Flying Dutchman. They were so close that he could see the agitated flare of the old man's nostrils, the thumb of his hand nervously resting on the hammer of the shotgun. With disguised suspicion and anger, they stared up at Will, and he winced as his eyes met those of the younger Dubois. The fierce dark eyes were cold and alive with scorn and contempt and open disgust. For an instant he felt like a real pig, a bastard for what he was about to do to these unsuspecting people. For on the blind side of the wrecker, Tony Fisher, Louis Krause and Bailey were just busy with a dirty, evil and inhumane deed. Between Louis and Tony, they lifted the open-top 44-gallon drum and slowly toppled it over the side, allowing its red, stinking and sticky contents to gush into the sea. And as the dead, rotting, day-old blood from the abattoir splashed into the sea, Upcurrent from the unsuspecting divers, it's dissolved and dispersed in the seawater, relentlessly being carried along the currents to where the super-sensitive organs of the deadly monsters of the deep would pick it up. 10 meters upcurrent of the Flying Dutchman, Bailey rolled the second half of the donkey's carcass into the sea. A huge chunk of meat turned over and over as it sank to the bottom. It came to rest a little over 5 meters from the still unsuspecting divers. Even before the last of the stinking dead blood sloshed into the sea, a monstrous beast had picked up the infuriating smell and with majestic sweeps of its tail drove against the current in the direction of the source. The shark was big, well over 15 feet long, from its massive pointed snout to its double-bladed tail. It was a monstrous blue fin shark, or as it was more notoriously and popularly known, a great white or white death. Its sandpaper blue hide was almost grey in the deep water, its belly a pale white and its dorsal fin, all of 3 feet high with the impassive eyes beside the large broad head. It swam with its mouth half open, savouring the maddening tastes of blood as the water flew through the deadly grinning mouth and out through the lateral slits and its gills on either side of its huge head. Ons sal môre aand weer aangaan met The Long Lost Grave. Mooi aand verder.